Imagine an empire so terrifying, its very name became a synonym for destruction. Yet in the spring of 1223, a vast European army marched unknowingly towards a trap that would erase 80,000 men from existence. This isn't just a battle. It's a brutal lesson in hubris. From the steppes of Central Asia, a force unlike any the world had ever witnessed had erupted. The Mongol Empire. Their lightning conquests had already reshaped an entire continent. A whirlwind of horsemen and arrows that swept away ancient kingdoms and venerable dynasties with chilling efficiency. But think about this. Despite their monumental reach, their true nature remained a terrifying enigma to the distant West. Across the sprawling, fertile lands of what we now call Eastern Europe, life in the Rus principalities and the Cuman Khanate proceeded with a familiar rhythm of alliances, rivalries, and the seasonal ebb and flow of trade. Grand princes squabbled over territorial claims. Nomadic Cuman tribes grazed their herds. This was a world of known enemies and understood threats, a canvas of medieval complexity. Yet, on the horizon, an unprecedented shadow was stretching. Could they have truly understood the sheer, existential threat that was about to arrive? What these disparate peoples perceived as mere raiding parties, or perhaps an extension of the nomadic skirmishes they were accustomed to, was in fact the vanguard of an entirely new form of warfare. This was not a clash of feudal lords or tribal chieftains. This was a meticulously orchestrated campaign by two of history's most brilliant military minds, Subutai and Gebe. Their objective wasn't plunder, but reconnaissance, domination, and the systematic dismantling of any potential resistance. A chilling thought, isn't it? They weren't just fighting battles. They were mapping the future conquest of an entire continent. The Battle of Khalkha, often overshadowed by later, larger Mongol invasions, stands as a pivotal moment precisely because it was the first brutal demonstration of this sophisticated, alien military strategy. It was here, on the banks of a minor river, that a combined army, far superior in numbers, brimming with bravado and perhaps a fatal overconfidence, was lured into a meticulously crafted ambush. 80,000 men, a staggering figure for the era, were about to vanish from the face of the earth. How does such an overwhelming force, defending their own lands, fall victim to such a complete and catastrophic defeat? This is the question that haunts the Khalkha River, a chilling testament to strategic genius against unsuspecting might. Forget everything you think you know about ancient warfare. The Mongol army wasn't just numerous. It was a psychological weapon, a meticulously engineered death machine perfected through generations of conquest. But how did they transform nomadic riders into the most devastating military force the world had ever seen? The answer lies in an organizational brilliance that bordered on genius, a system forged in the crucible of Genghis Khan's ruthless unification of the steppe tribes. Imagine a military structure where loyalty was absolute, merit superseded lineage, and every man, from foot soldier to field marshal, understood his precise role within a vast, interconnected machine. This was the Yasa, Genghis Khan's legal and military code, a set of unyielding laws that bound disparate clans into a singular, terrifying entity. Every soldier was part of a Tumun, 10,000 men, a Mingan, 1,000, a Jagan, 100, and an Arband, 10, making command and control unparalleled. But think about this for a moment. How do you instill such unwavering discipline in a people renowned for their fierce independence? The Mongol answer was simple: absolute accountability. If one man in an Arband fled, the entire 10 were executed. If an Arband deserted, the Jagan faced the same fate. Death was the penalty for desertion, for looting without permission, for even losing a piece of equipment. Conversely, courage and skill were rewarded with promotion, loot, and influence, creating a potent incentive structure that transcended traditional feudal loyalties. This wasn't merely a fear-based system. It was a profound cultural shift that transformed individual fighters into a collective force, each man's survival tied to the next. At the heart of this engine of conquest was the cavalry, but not just any cavalry. These were men born on horseback, learning to ride almost before they could walk, their bodies adapted to the saddle, their eyes scanning the horizon for opportunity or threat. Each warrior brought not one, but 3 to 5 horses, allowing for incredible speed and endurance as they rotated mounts throughout the day, ensuring fresh steeds for battle and relentless pursuit. Think about the sheer logistics of moving such a multi-horse army across vast distances, entirely self-sufficient. This intimate connection with their horses meant that a Mongol soldier could sleep in the saddle, eat on the move, and traverse distances that would break any contemporary army. They were their horses. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, a marvel of engineering crafted from layers of horn, wood, and sinew. This isn't your simple longbow. This was a weapon that delivered immense power, firing arrows with enough force to penetrate enemy armor at incredible ranges, sometimes up to 300 meters. A skilled Mongol archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, a hail of death unmatched by any European or Asian counterpart. Could any medieval shield truly withstand that kind of sustained, high-velocity volley? Their quivers held 60 to 90 arrows, often of different types for different targets, allowing them to switch from armor-piercing bodkin points to whistling arrows for psychological effect, or incendiary arrows to ignite wooden fortifications. The Mongols' tactical innovations were equally terrifying. Their signature move, the taluma, or feigned retreat, was a masterpiece of battlefield psychology. They would charge, fire volleys, then suddenly break and flee, drawing the enemy into a pursuit that inevitably led them into a prearranged ambush, often an encirclement by flanking forces. This wasn't a desperate maneuver. It was a calculated trap, executed with chilling precision. This very deception would prove devastating at Khalkha. They were masters of the feigned retreat, using it not out of cowardice, but as a bait to lure unsuspecting opponents into their carefully orchestrated killing zones. When outright charges failed, the Mongols were remarkably adaptable. They quickly incorporated siege engineers and artillery from their conquered Chinese territories, transforming themselves from steppe raiders into formidable besiegers capable of reducing even the most heavily fortified cities. Necessity bred innovation. They deployed catapults, trebuchets, and even early forms of gunpowder weapons, demonstrating a terrifying willingness to adopt and integrate the best military technologies from their enemies. Their logistical system, or rather their lack of a conventional one, was another key to their unstoppable momentum. Mongol armies traveled light, carrying minimal supplies. They were largely self-sufficient, living off the land, hunting game, fishing, and sustaining themselves on dried meat and kumis, fermented mare's milk. Each soldier carried a small kit, including a cooking pot, a leather bottle for water, and a repair kit for his bow. Their ability to cross vast deserts and steppes without a supply train slowing them down baffled their more conventionally equipped adversaries. Furthermore, the yam, their sophisticated postal relay system, ensured rapid communication and allowed for strategic deployment of resources and intelligence across their vast empire. Their postal system was faster than most armies could march. Intelligence gathering was paramount. Before any major campaign, Mongol spies, merchants, and even missionaries would infiltrate enemy territories, gathering detailed information on terrain, fortifications, political stability, and troop strengths. They knew your weaknesses before you did. Detailed maps were drawn, and even the psychology of local rulers was assessed, providing the Khans with an unparalleled understanding of their future battlefields and opponents. This meticulous preparation removed much of the guesswork from war, allowing them to strike with surgical precision. On the battlefield, communication was constant and flawless. Commanders used a sophisticated system of flags, horns, and drums to relay orders across vast plains, ensuring perfect synchronization of their decentralized units. A ripple of flags across the horizon, a specific series of horn blasts, these were the instruments of a symphony of destruction, directing thousands of horsemen in complex maneuvers, shifting formations, and coordinated attacks. Finally, there was the psychological warfare. The Mongols cultivated a reputation for unparalleled brutality. They would offer terms of surrender, comply, and your people might live. Resist and suffer annihilation. Cities that resisted were razed, their populations massacred, often piled into gruesome pyramids of skulls, sending a chilling message to anyone contemplating defiance. They used rumors, deliberate acts of terror, and a relentless advance to break the enemy's will before a single arrow was fired. How do you fight an enemy that has already defeated your will? Their reputation preceded them, often causing panic and mass surrenders, minimizing their own casualties and speeding their conquests. This wasn't random violence. It was a calculated strategy, a blueprint for total war designed to subjugate, not just defeat. The sheer speed, discipline, and adaptability of this war machine allowed them to sweep across Asia with unprecedented force, shattering empires that had stood for centuries. From the Yellow River to the Caspian Sea, their legend grew, leaving a trail of terror and submission. The stage was set for unprecedented carnage. This terrifying engine of conquest, honed to perfection, was about to turn its gaze west, towards the unsuspecting principalities of Rus, setting in motion a chain of events that would culminate in the Battle of the Kalka River. While the armies of Europe squabbled, two of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, Gebe and Subutai, were already deep within their lands, not to conquer, but to observe, to probe, to learn the very weaknesses that would later be exploited. This wasn't an invasion. It was a survey for future annihilation. Imagine a surgeon meticulously mapping a body before the first cut. That was the Great Raid of 1221 to 1223, an epic reconnaissance in force that would forever alter the course of Eurasian history, a silent harbinger of unimaginable destruction. After the brutal collapse of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan dispatched his two most formidable hounds of war, Gebe and Subutai, on a mission unprecedented in military history. Their objective, to circle the Caspian Sea, a daring odyssey across unknown, hostile lands, collecting intelligence. But think about this. They weren't leading the main Mongol horde. This was a comparatively small, elite force, perhaps 20,000 strong at its peak, far from any friendly territory. Could such a force truly reshape the known world? Their journey began, a relentless eastward sweep through northern Persia, a landscape already scorched by the main Mongol advance. They skirted the southern shores of the Caspian, moving like a desert wind, imperceptible until they struck. Their first major test came in the autumn of 1221, as they turned north, heading into the formidable Caucasus Mountains and the wealthy Kingdom of Georgia. King George IV was a renowned warrior, proud of his heavily armored cavalry, inheritors of a martial tradition that had long held sway in the region. He gathered his forces, confident in his strength, ready to face this strange, new enemy. The Mongols, however, did not fight by the rules. At the Battle of Kanani, Gebe and Subutai unleashed their signature tactic, the feigned retreat. They engaged the Georgian vanguard, skirmishing briefly before turning their horses and appearing to flee in disarray. The Georgians, seeing their opportunity, charged headlong, their heavy cavalry thundering across the plains, eager to cut down the retreating enemy. It was a trap set with chilling precision. As the Georgians pursued, losing cohesion in their eagerness, the Mongol retreat peeled back, revealing fresh Mongol contingents hidden on the flanks. Arrows rained down, followed by a devastating, encircling charge. What must that moment of realization have felt like for the Georgian knights? The hunters became the hunted in a terrifying instant. The battle was a bloodbath, a catastrophic defeat for Georgia. This wasn't just a victory, it was an intelligence coup. The Mongols now understood the strengths and, crucially, the weaknesses of European-style heavy cavalry. This lesson would be brutally relearned by others. From Georgia, the Mongols plunged deeper into the Caucasus in 1222, traversing treacherous mountain passes, terrain utterly unsuitable for traditional cavalry. How did they achieve this? Their horses were hardy, their men adaptable, and their logistical planning meticulous, but above all, their determination was absolute. Here, they encountered the Alans and Circassians, fierce mountain peoples who, recognizing the existential threat, formed an alliance with the Kuman Kipchaks of the steppes. This was a formidable coalition, potentially capable of halting the Mongol advance. The Mongols were outnumbered, deep behind enemy lines, facing unified resistance. But unity was a fragile thing, especially when confronted by Mongol cunning. Gebe and Subutai, masters of psychological warfare, sent envoys to the Cumans. They appealed to their shared nomadic heritage, reminding them of old grievances against the settled Alans, offering peace and plunder if they would abandon their allies. "You are of the same race as us," the message likely read. "Let us not fight each other. We will leave you in peace, and you can take your pickings from the Alans." It was a lie, a cynical manipulation, but it worked. The Cumans, ever opportunistic, defected, leaving the Alans exposed. The betrayal was immediate and devastating. The isolated Alans were systematically crushed by the Mongols. And then, with the Alans annihilated, Gebe and Subutai turned on the Cumans. The promise of peace was a mirage. The Mongols pursued their former allies relentlessly, a cruel lesson in the cost of treachery. Divide and conquer, a timeless strategy, but never executed with such cold, ruthless precision. Could any established power predict such Machiavellian brilliance? The Mongol forces then swept onto the vast, open Kuman-Kipchak steppes, their true domain. Here, their unmatched horsemanship and tactical mobility came into their own. They pursued the fleeing Kuman remnants, including the powerful Konkotan, driving them westward in disarray. Every mile covered, every skirmish fought was a data point. They mapped the land, noted water sources, observed the political landscape, and assessed the fighting capabilities of every tribe and principality. This wasn't merely a raid. It was a comprehensive intelligence operation, a living map being drawn in blood and dust. The Mongols spent the winter of 1222 to 1223 in the Kuman lands, resting their horses, resupplying, and refining their plans. This period was not one of idleness. It was a period of intense observation and integration of new information. They were studying their prey, understanding the rhythms of the steppe, the alliances, and the weaknesses. Imagine them, camped in the bitter cold, their scouts fanning out across hundreds of miles, each returning with fragments of information, piecing together a terrifying mosaic of the world to their west. By spring, their task was nearly complete. They had circumnavigated the Caspian Sea, defeated multiple nations, exposed their military tactics, and created widespread chaos. The Kuman Konkotan, desperate, had fled into the lands of his neighbors, the Rus princes, begging for aid against this incomprehensible foe. He brought tales of horror, of an enemy unlike any seen before, a force that struck without warning and vanished without a trace, leaving only destruction. This entire expedition, spanning thousands of miles and 2 years, was a masterclass in strategic patience and predatory intelligence gathering. Gebe and Subutai were not just winning battles. They were winning the war before it even truly began. They were the tip of the spear, sent to test the armor of kingdoms that didn't even know they were under scrutiny. The ghosts on the steppe were about to make themselves terrifyingly real, and their meticulously gathered knowledge would soon be unleashed with devastating effect upon the unsuspecting Rus and their Kuman allies. The stage was set for a confrontation none could have truly prepared for. While the Mongols perfected their art of war, the Rus principalities were locked in petty squabbles, brothers against brothers. It took the terrifying shadow of an unknown enemy to forge an alliance, but was it already too late? Their internal divisions were a blueprint for their demise. Imagine, for a moment, a vast, powerful family. Instead of uniting against an outside threat, they are consumed by endless feuds over inheritance, status, and perceived slights. This was the Kievan Rus in the early 13th century. Not a unified state, but a patchwork quilt of independent, often warring principalities, each ruled by a prince of the Rurikid dynasty. What could possibly unite them? From the ancient, fading glory of Kiev to the ambitious power of Gallic, and the mercantile wealth of Novgorod, loyalty was often a matter of shifting alliances and immediate self-interest, not national cohesion. Think of it as a sprawling, decentralized empire where the Grand Prince of Kiev held symbolic authority, little more than a first among equals, with no real power to command the others. Princes like Mstislav the Bold of Gallic, a charismatic and daring warrior, routinely challenged their cousins for territory, trade routes, and prestige. Internal conflict was the norm, not the exception. Isn't that a tragic irony, that they were so adept at fighting each other, yet so unprepared for the truly existential threat looming on their horizon? This political fragmentation meant there was no single army, no unified command structure, and crucially, no shared strategic vision. Each principality maintained its own forces, loyal only to its own prince. This decentralized power structure, while fostering local resilience, was a fatal weakness when confronted by an enemy of unprecedented scale and organization. Now, into this volatile landscape, crashed the remnants of the Cuman Khanate. For centuries, these nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe had been the Rus' most persistent adversaries. Their horse archers a constant terror on the southern borders, raiding settlements and clashing in brutal skirmishes. They were the traditional enemy. But in 1222, the Cumans were not raiders. They were refugees, their lands devastated, their strength broken by an utterly alien force, the advance guard of the Mongol Empire, led by Jebe and Subutai. The Cumans, desperate and facing annihilation, did the unthinkable. They turned to their old enemies, the Rus, for salvation. Their Khan, Koshin, fled to his son-in-law, Mstislav the Bold of Gallic, bearing tales of an unstoppable army, a Tatars from the east who consumed everything in their path. Koshin's plea wasn't just for assistance. It was a desperate warning. "Today they have taken our land," he implored. "Tomorrow they will take yours." A provocative thought. If your sworn enemy came begging for help against an even greater unknown foe, would you listen? Would you trust them? The Rus princes were deeply conflicted. Their history with the Cumans was one of betrayal and warfare. Yet, the sheer terror in Koshin's voice, the magnitude of the Cuman defeat, suggested something truly different was unfolding on the steppes. This was no ordinary raiding party. The call went out. Mstislav the Bold, known for his audacious spirit, recognized the gravity of the situation. He convened a council of princes in Kiev, urging them to put aside their petty differences. It was a momentous, unprecedented gathering. Imagine the tension in that assembly. Generations of animosity simmering beneath the surface, yet overshadowed by a nascent, chilling fear. The princes debated furiously. Many were reluctant, suspicious of Cuman motives, or simply unwilling to commit their precious forces to a distant, uncertain war. "Why should we fight for the Cumans?" some argued. "Let them deal with their own problem." Mstislav III of Kiev, the nominal Grand Prince, lent his weight to the cause, swayed by the Cuman Khan's impassioned pleas and the potential ramifications of ignoring this new threat. Did he fully grasp the danger, or was it a calculated gamble to maintain his precarious authority? Ultimately, the argument for unity, however fragile, prevailed. The Cuman Khan, Koshin, reportedly offered vast treasures, horses, camels, silver, and gold, as a guarantee of their sincerity and as payment for the Rus' assistance. He also appealed to a shared sense of impending doom. He stripped naked before the princes, a powerful, symbolic act of utter submission and vulnerability, demonstrating the depth of his desperation. He essentially said, "We have nothing left to lose, and you will have nothing left to gain if you do not join us." The alliance was formed, a fragile pact forged in fear and necessity. Princes from Kiev, Gallic, Chernigov, Volhynia, Smolensk, and other regions answered the call, though not all principalities sent troops, underscoring the enduring lack of complete unity. They gathered their forces, a diverse host of heavy cavalry, infantry, and lighter Cuman horse archers. This was an alliance of convenience, not conviction. A shared enemy was a powerful motivator, but it was not enough to erase generations of mistrust. Consider the implications. The very enemies who had plundered Rus lands for decades were now marching alongside them, an act that would have been inconceivable just months earlier. This desperate alliance was a gamble, a last-ditch effort to push back an unknown horror. But critically, they knew next to nothing about their new foe. They perceived the Tatars as merely another, albeit powerful, nomadic tribe, perhaps a larger, more organized version of the Cumans themselves. This profound ignorance, a blind spot in their strategic thinking, would prove catastrophic. They underestimated the enemy, and they overestimated their own fractured strength. The stage was set, not for victory, but for a devastating lesson in the true cost of disunity. What if the greatest army in Europe was lured to its doom by nothing more than a carefully orchestrated retreat? The Mongols didn't just fight battles. They engineered them. The Khalkha wasn't an accidental encounter. It was a predator's patiently executed trap. After their initial, devastating raid into the Cuman lands, leaving behind a trail of desolation and fear, the Mongol vanguard, led by the brilliant generals Subutai and Jebe, suddenly reversed course. They weren't turning tail out of fear, as the Cumans and their newly allied Rus princes so desperately wanted to believe. No, this was the beginning of a magnificent deception, a military masterclass in psychological warfare. Think about this. Their objective wasn't merely to avoid battle. It was to create the perfect battlefield, on their terms, deep within a hostile land. The Allied forces, a grand coalition of Rus principalities and Cuman hordes, had assembled with unprecedented numbers, a force estimated at 80,000 strong. They believed they were pursuing a weakened, panicked enemy. But what if that weakness was merely a mask? What if every single step back by the Mongols was a calculated enticement, a tug on the line of an unsuspecting fish? For 9 relentless days, the Mongols retreated eastward, drawing the colossal Rus-Cuman army further and further from the Dnieper River, away from their familiar supply lines, their defensive fortifications, and the comforting support of their own territory. This wasn't a tactical withdrawal. It was a strategic ensnarement. Imagine the scene. Vast clouds of dust kicked up by tens of thousands of horses and men, stretching for miles across the sprawling, monotonous steppe. The Rus heavy cavalry, accustomed to swift, decisive charges, now found themselves embroiled in a grueling chase, their supplies dwindling with every passing mile. Do you understand the sheer logistical nightmare this imposed on the pursuing army? They were dragging siege engines, supply wagons, and a diverse array of foot soldiers and heavy cavalry across terrain that offered little in the way of sustenance or shelter. Yet, the Mongols were careful not to make their retreat too convincing. They needed to maintain the illusion of vulnerability. Occasionally, they would turn and engage in minor skirmishes, typically with the Cuman vanguard who, with their lighter cavalry, were always at the forefront of the pursuit. These weren't pitched battles. They were calculated feints. The Mongols would fight just long enough to inflict a few casualties, perhaps capture some horses, and then melt away, leaving behind a tantalizing trail of captured livestock, abandoned equipment, and even some supposedly valuable goods. This was brilliant. Each discarded saddle, each stray cow, each minor victory reinforced a dangerous narrative in the minds of the Rus and Cuman commanders. The Mongols were indeed weak, desperate, and laden with plunder. It was a classic bait and switch, but on a strategic scale rarely witnessed in military history. Can you picture the Rus princes, already prone to internal squabbling, seeing these scraps and feeling their confidence swell, their desire for personal glory intensified? The Cuman leaders, particularly Konkotan, whose lands had been ravaged, were especially eager for vengeance and spoils. Their light cavalry, fast and aggressive, constantly pressed the Mongol rear. And each time they did, the Mongols would offer just enough resistance to make the Cumans feel they were winning, before slipping away again. This wasn't just physical movement. It was a deep psychological manipulation. It built a profound, almost intoxicating overconfidence in the Allied ranks. They began to believe they were chasing a fleeing horde, not stalking an apex predator. Little did they know, every step deeper was a step closer to the precipice. The Mongol cavalry, masters of endurance and steppe warfare, were entirely at home in this desolate landscape. Their horses were tougher, their riders more accustomed to living off the land, requiring far less in the way of established supply lines. They were moving with a purpose, guiding their unsuspecting prey to a predetermined kill zone. This was not random. It was meticulous planning, centuries in the making, perfected through countless campaigns. As the days turned into a week and more, the Rus-Cuman army began to show the strains of such a prolonged, aggressive pursuit. Discipline frayed. The cohesion that was always tenuous among the various independent Rus princes and their Cuman allies began to crack under the relentless pressure of the chase. Each prince, each commander, now believed his contingent was the one truly pressing the Mongols, his efforts deserving of the most glory and plunder. This created a dangerous competitive spirit, leading to a breakdown in unified command. Why is a unified command so critical? Because without it, a large army becomes a collection of individual units, susceptible to being picked apart. The Mongols understood this implicitly. Their feigned retreats weren't just about drawing the enemy out. They were about fragmenting them. They wanted the Rus and Cumans to arrive at the chosen battlefield not as a cohesive, disciplined force, but as a scattered, exhausted, and overconfident mob, each eager to strike the first blow and claim the richest spoils. They didn't just target the enemy's body. They targeted their mind, their morale, their very command structure. The distance covered was staggering. Over 250 kilometers in 9 days, a grueling pace for an army of that size, especially one that included heavy infantry and artillery. Think of the toll this took on the men and horses, particularly those not accustomed to the unique demands of steppe warfare. Meanwhile, the Mongols, light and mobile, were conserving their strength, merely leading their prey along the path of their choosing. They were like a seasoned angler, slowly but surely reeling in a massive catch, letting it struggle just enough to tire itself out. Every discarded item, every minor defeat they orchestrated, served to deepen the illusion. The Mongols were painting a picture of a desperate, disorganized rabble, reinforcing the Rus and Cuman belief in their own superiority and the inevitability of their triumph. This psychological manipulation, carefully calculated to build overconfidence and scatter the Allied forces, meticulously prepared them for the kill, demonstrating a level of tactical deception rarely seen in military history. They weren't just setting a trap. They were customizing it for the precise psychological weaknesses of their adversaries. And the bait, so carefully laid, was now firmly swallowed. The stage was set for a slaughter. The river Kalka wasn't just a geographical feature. It was a line in the sand, crossed by an army blinded by overconfidence, rushing headlong into an ambush they refused to believe possible. Every step closer to that river was a step closer to oblivion. For 18 grueling days, the Rus and Cuman allied forces had pursued the elusive Mongol vanguard, an odyssey across the vast, undulating steppe. This wasn't a strategic retreat by the Mongols. It was a deliberate, masterful feint, drawing their overzealous adversaries deeper into a trap. But think about this. How often does the sheer thrill of the chase blind the hunter to the true intentions of its quarry? The Allied army, estimated at up to 80,000 strong, represented a formidable concentration of power, a collection of Rus principalities and Cuman tribes unified by a common, if fragile, purpose. Yet, this numerical strength was a deceptive facade. The prolonged pursuit had frayed their discipline, stretched their supply lines to breaking point, and exposed the deep fissures within their command structure. Imagine an unwieldy serpent, its head striking out in multiple directions, each scale attempting to move independently. Weeks of marching, under the relentless sun and swirling dust, had taken their toll not just on the men's bodies, but on their morale and cohesion. What happens when exhaustion meets an already fragile alliance? By the time they neared the Kalka River, the Allied force was less a unified army and more a sprawling, argumentative procession. The internal bickering among the numerous Rus princes had reached a fever pitch, each nobleman guarding his own prerogatives and refusing to yield authority to another. This wasn't a joint operation. It was a series of overlapping, often contradictory, personal vendettas masquerading as a military campaign. The Grand Prince Mstislav Romanovich of Kiev, nominally the senior commander, struggled to assert control over his headstrong peers, many of whom commanded forces larger than his own. Could a ship with a dozen captains, each vying for the helm, ever hope to navigate a storm? The Kalka itself, a relatively minor river flowing into the Sea of Azov, seemed innocuous enough, but it was precisely its unassuming nature that made it a perfect kill zone. Its banks were uneven, dotted with treacherous ravines and sudden changes in elevation, terrain the Mongols knew intimately, having scouted it meticulously. They didn't just stumble upon this river. They chose it, like a hunter choosing the perfect snare site. In stark contrast, The Allied command demonstrated an astonishing lack of reconnaissance. No detailed maps, no comprehensive scouting reports, just a blind rush forward. They were charging into a dark room, ignoring the blueprints the enemy had left in plain sight. It was Mstislav Mstislavich, known as the Bold, Prince of Gallic, who would deliver the fatal blow to any semblance of Allied coordination. Impatient, hot-headed, and hungry for personal glory, Mstislav the Bold saw the Mongols across the river not as a cunning enemy, but as a flighty prey. He convinced himself that they were on the verge of escaping, a notion fed by the Mongol feints and staged retreats. This was more than overconfidence. It was a catastrophic failure of strategic imagination. What drives a commander to abandon all tactical sense, to prioritize ego over victory? Without consulting Mstislav Romanovich of Kiev, or indeed any other significant Allied commander, Mstislav the Bold issued orders for his contingent to cross the Kalka and engage. His forces, primarily Galician Rus and a large number of Cumans, began to ford the river in a chaotic, piecemeal fashion. This wasn't a disciplined advance with clear objectives and supporting maneuvers. It was a disorderly scramble, a fragmented assault born of impulsiveness. Imagine sending a wave of soldiers across a river, not as a united front, but as individual swimmers, each hoping to reach the far bank alone. The lack of coordination was utterly devastating. As Mstislav the Bold's vanguard moved across, the vast majority of the Rus army, including the strong contingents of Kiev and Chernihiv, remained on the western bank, largely unaware of Mstislav the Bold's sudden, unauthorized move. They were spectators to their own impending doom, their battle formations unready, their commanders bewildered. Their inability to grasp the true nature of the Mongol threat, fueled by a deep-seated contempt for nomads, blinded them to the obvious. They simply couldn't fathom that these seemingly fleeing horsemen were setting a trap. This wasn't just a failure of leadership. It was a failure of imagination, a fatal underestimation of a truly revolutionary military force. The initial engagement, a series of skirmishes as Mstislav the Bold's advance guard clashed with the Mongol rear, seemed to confirm the Rus assumptions. The Mongols again gave ground, reinforcing the illusion of a disorganized retreat. This expertly executed feint was the final, critical piece of the trap. The Mongol horse archers, masters of the Parthian shot and the rapid withdrawal, drew the eager Rus further into the waiting jaws of their main army. Every step taken by the chasing Rus was a step deeper into the killing zone. History whispers a harsh lesson. Hubris is often the deadliest weapon an enemy possesses. The Kalka River, once merely a geographical marker, was about to become the grave of an army that refused to believe in its own defeat until it was far too late. When the Mongols finally turned, it wasn't a desperate stand. It was a meticulously timed, perfectly executed ambush. The feigned retreat snapped shut, and the vast, disorganized Rus army found itself caught between a relentless enemy and a river of no escape. This was not a battle. It was a slaughter. For 9 days, the Mongol vanguard, commanded by the legendary Jebe, had maintained a disciplined, agonizingly slow withdrawal, luring the pursuing Rus and Cuman forces ever eastward, away from their supply lines, away from coherent command, and deeper into unfamiliar, open terrain. Why would veteran warriors fall for such an ancient trick? They had been promised an easy victory, a chance to smash the Tatars and seize their spoils. But think about this. The Mongols were not simply retreating. They were drawing a line in the sand, a line that the Rus princes, blinded by hubris and the thrill of the chase, eagerly crossed. The moment came on the eastern bank of the Kalka River, a seemingly insignificant body of water that would soon become a chasm of death. As the leading Cuman horsemen, followed closely by the impetuous Rus vanguard, surged forward, believing they had finally cornered their elusive foe, the entire Mongol disposition shifted with terrifying precision. It wasn't a gradual pivot. It was an instantaneous, choreographed transformation from flight to attack. One moment, scattered detachments seemed to be fleeing in disarray. The next, they coalesced into deadly formations, their banners snapping in the wind, their faces grim and determined. Imagine the sudden, heart-stopping realization that must have washed over the Cuman chiefs. The hunters had become the hunted. The feigned retreat, a hallmark of steppe warfare for centuries, was a trap that rarely failed. From the flanks, previously unseen units of Mongol horse archers emerged from hollows and ridges, closing in like the jaws of a monstrous beast. They didn't just appear. They materialized with a ghost-like efficiency that spoke of countless drills and an almost telepathic understanding between commanders and their men. What good is courage when you're caught in a crossfire you never saw coming? The ground, which had felt firm beneath the hooves of the advancing cavalry, now seemed to open up, swallowing their dreams of glory. The Mongol counterattack was not a chaotic melee. It was a devastatingly precise application of their military doctrine. They used their superior mobility to maximum effect, their light cavalry galloping in sweeping arcs, pouring a relentless hail of arrows into the tightly packed Cuman formations. Each arrow was a whisper of death, a whirring shard designed to penetrate armor, unhorse a rider, or simply sow panic. But it wasn't just the individual arrows. It was the sheer volume, a dark cloud blotting out the sun, accompanied by the chilling thrum of thousands of bowstrings. A single Mongol horse archer could loose an astonishing 10 to 12 arrows per minute, often with deadly accuracy at ranges up to 200 meters. Now multiply that by thousands. The psychological impact alone was crippling. The Cuman lines, already fatigued from the long pursuit and disordered by the uneven terrain, began to waver under this ceaseless barrage. Their countercharges, brave but increasingly desperate, found no solid target. The Mongols would simply melt away, drawing them further out, then reappearing to strike from another angle. It was a macabre dance of death, where one side dictated every step. The flanking maneuvers were particularly brutal. As the Cumans attempted to reorient themselves against the arrows raining from their front, Mongol cavalry units, heavier and armed with lances and sabers, crashed into their exposed sides. This wasn't a frontal clash. It was an enveloping assault, a pincer movement designed to crush resistance rather than merely defeat it. The momentum of the Cumans' forward surge was instantly inverted, turning their advance into a chaotic backward scramble. The collapse of the Cuman lines was shockingly swift and absolute. Their vaunted speed and agility, once their greatest asset, now became their greatest weakness as they found themselves caught, unable to maneuver effectively within the tight confines of the Mongol trap. Panic, a contagion more potent than any disease, began to spread through their ranks. The once proud warriors, witnessing their comrades falling by the dozens, their horses screaming, their formations dissolving, broke. They didn't just retreat. They fled in a blind, unthinking stampede. But where could they flee? Backwards, towards their Rus allies, towards the very forces that were supposed to be their strength. This was the moment the trap became truly devastating. The panicked Cuman retreat crashed headlong into the advancing, unready Rus principalities. Imagine the scene. Thousands of terrified horsemen, screaming, desperate, riding down their own allies in a desperate bid for survival. It was like a human wave, not of attack, but of pure, unadulterated fear, engulfing everything in its path. The impact was catastrophic. The tightly packed Rus formations, each prince commanding his own contingent, were instantly shattered. Spears were broken, shields were trampled, and men who had prepared to fight an external enemy suddenly found themselves wrestling with internal chaos. There was no clear distinction between friend and foe in that maelstrom of terror and flying hooves. Orders became meaningless shouts lost in the din of battle and the shrieks of the dying. The Rus commanders, already struggling with the inherent disunity of their coalition, were now completely unable to coordinate any meaningful resistance. How do you issue commands when your own lines are being ripped apart by your supposed allies? The Cuman flight created gaping holes in the Rus defense, turning their flanks into exposed vulnerabilities. It created a cascading effect of chaos and confusion, a deadly domino tumble that left the Rus army bewildered, disoriented, and utterly demoralized before they had even properly engaged the Mongols. The Mongols, masters of exploitation, did not hesitate. They pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency, following hard on the heels of the fleeing Cumans, driving them further into the Rus ranks, turning the Rus' internal disarray into systematic annihilation. Their horse archers continued to pepper the now disorganized masses, picking off commanders and leaders, deepening the psychological trauma. Their heavier cavalry, previously held in reserve, surged forward, carving bloody paths through the shattered Rus formations. The Khalkha River, which had seemed like a minor geographical feature, now became an insurmountable barrier. Behind them, a relentless, perfectly coordinated enemy. Before them, a watery grave. Men, desperate to escape the Mongol onslaught, plunged into the river, only to be swept away by the current or drowned under the weight of their armor. Others were simply pushed into its embrace by the sheer press of bodies, turning the riverbanks into a bottleneck of despair. Could anything have prepared them for this level of utter despair? The hope of victory, so vibrant just hours before, had been replaced by the chilling certainty of defeat. The Rus army, despite its immense numbers, was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It was a fragmented collection of men being systematically butchered. This was not a battle of equals. It was a brutal, one-sided lesson in military supremacy. The masterful control of the battlefield by the Mongol generals, particularly Subutai and Jebe, was undeniable. Their patience in the feigned retreat, their precise timing in the counterattack, their seamless coordination of different cavalry types, and their ruthless exploitation of the enemy's disorganization were all textbook examples of military genius. They had anticipated every move, understood the psychology of their opponents, and executed their plan with chilling perfection. The Khalkha wasn't just a battle. It was a devastating blueprint for destruction, marking the terrifying arrival of an unstoppable force. The Mongols vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind a devastated land and a profound question. Why did they come, and would they return? The Battle of Khalkha was more than a singular defeat. It was a chilling prologue to a generation of darkness that would engulf Eastern Europe. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of desolation, both physical and psychological. Across the vast steppes and the emerging Rus lands, the scale of the catastrophe slowly dawned on the survivors. What did it mean for a continent to lose 80% of its fighting force in a single brutal engagement? The princely retinues, the very backbone of Rus military power, were decimated. Consider the sheer leadership void. An estimated 11 Rus princes lay dead, a staggering loss of a generation of commanders, strategists, and political anchors. Their bodies, if recovered, were often indistinguishable from their men, a testament to the Mongol strategy of annihilating leadership first. But think about this, the Mongols did not immediately press their advantage. They didn't sweep through the grieving Rus principalities, seizing cities and establishing garrisons. Instead, as mysteriously as they had arrived, they retreated, leaving behind only the smoldering ruins of settlements and the indelible memory of a defeat unlike any other. Why? This seemingly inexplicable withdrawal was not a sign of weakness or disinterest. It was a testament to the iron discipline and strategic foresight of the Mongol Empire. Subutai and Jebe, the brilliant generals who had orchestrated the Khalkha massacre, were not acting on their own initiative. They were fulfilling a specific directive from Genghis Khan himself. A deep reconnaissance mission, a probing thrust designed to map new territories, assess potential enemies, and gather intelligence. Their task was to scout the western lands and report back to the Great Khan. They had pushed the boundaries of their mission, pursuing the defeated Cumans and stumbled upon the Rus. But their ultimate objective was always to return east. It was a mission accomplished brutally and comprehensively. The brutal truth? Khalkha was a mere scouting party for what was to come. These scouts, comprising perhaps 20,000 horsemen, had just annihilated a force 4 times their size. What would happen when the entire Mongol war machine turned its gaze westward? The retreating Mongol cavalry riding back eastward were not fleeing. They were simply regrouping, preparing their report, and eventually integrating their knowledge into a much larger, far more devastating invasion plan. They were like the advance guard of a tsunami, the initial ripple before the true, destructive wave. Meanwhile, back in the fractured world of Rus, the emotional fallout was profound. A deep, pervasive shock permeated every social stratum. The surviving princes, often young and inexperienced, inherited thrones destabilized by mass casualties and a terrifying new threat. The populace was demoralized, their faith in their protectors shattered. The very notion of military might, once defined by heavy cavalry and fortified towns, had been brutally redefined by the lightning speed and overwhelming cohesion of the Mongol horde. It was a paradigm shift no one was equipped to understand. This fear, this profound destabilization, should have been a catalyst for change. It should have forced unity, compelled introspection, and demanded a radical rethinking of military strategy. Yet, the crucial lessons of Khalkha, etched in blood and ruin, were largely ignored. Why this fatal oversight? Part of it was the sheer incomprehensibility of the enemy. The Mongols were not like the Pecheneg or the Cumans, familiar steppe foes with predictable raiding patterns. They were something entirely new, an enigma. But much of the failure stemmed from internal weaknesses that Khalkha only exacerbated. The Rus principalities, perpetually entangled in internecine squabbles, reverted to type. Dynastic rivalries flared anew, fueled by the power vacuum left by the fallen princes. Each prince, clinging fiercely to his individual sovereignty, seemed unable to grasp the existential threat that transcended their petty feuds. The idea of a unified command, a common defense, remained an elusive dream. They saw the Mongols as a distant menace, perhaps a one-off event, rather than a harbinger of imminent doom. They failed to understand the Mongols' discipline, their meticulous planning, their revolutionary use of feigned retreats and encirclement. They dismissed the Mongol archer as merely an annoying skirmisher, not the precision weapon of a combined arms force. This was not just military ignorance. It was a profound failure of political imagination. They lacked the ability to transcend their historical grievances and unite against a shared, annihilating threat. It was as if they had been shown a blueprint for their own destruction, and then chose to ignore it. The echoes of Khalkha faded, replaced by the familiar clamor of local politics and regional conflicts. A precious decade passed, a critical window of opportunity squandered. During this time, the Rus princes continued their internal squabbles, rebuilding their retinues slowly, but never fundamentally altering their tactical approach. They learned nothing new about the enemy, forgetting the terrifying efficiency they had witnessed. This fatal complacency, this unheeded warning, set the stage for the true catastrophe that would descend upon Eastern Europe. 10 years after Khalkha, under the ruthless leadership of Batu Khan, the full might of the Mongol Golden Horde returned. This time, they wouldn't just scout. They would conquer, reshape an entire continent, and leave an indelible mark on the course of Eastern European history. The prologue was over. The main act of devastation was about to begin. The Battle of the Khalkha remains a chilling testament to the power of strategic brilliance over brute force, unity over division, and foresight over hubris. What can this 800-year-old catastrophe teach us about preparing for the unforeseen and the price of underestimating a truly formidable foe? 8 centuries have passed since the thunder of hooves and the scream of arrows echoed across that fateful river. Yet the lessons etched into the blood-soaked soil of the Khalkha are as relevant today as they were then. We witnessed, in harrowing detail, the unparalleled genius of Mongol commanders like Subutai and Jebe, the dogs of war, who orchestrated a masterpiece of deception and destruction. These weren't just warriors. They were grandmasters of a brutal geopolitical chess game. Their feigned retreat, executed over 9 days across hundreds of miles, was not merely a tactic but a psychological weapon, meticulously designed to lure their adversaries into a false sense of victory and unrecoverable pursuit. Imagine the sheer discipline. Imagine the intelligence network required to maintain such an elaborate ruse. This wasn't a spontaneous retreat. It was an act of deliberate, calculated baiting. How many modern militaries could execute such a complex, sustained deception today? Contrast this with the fatal flaws of the Rus princes and their Cuman allies. Their alliance, ostensibly forged against a common enemy, was little more than a collection of squabbling chieftains, each more concerned with personal glory and preserving their own forces than with presenting a united front. Remember the disunity? They were a house divided, and as history consistently reminds us, a house divided rarely stands against a storm. Their overconfidence, fueled by early skirmishes and the Mongols' feigned retreat, blinded them to the true nature of the threat. They saw raiders not an invading army. They saw a minor annoyance, not an existential threat. But think about this. When was the last time internal strife didn't leave a nation vulnerable to external peril? They lacked intelligence both about the enemy's numbers and their revolutionary tactics. The Mongols didn't fight by the old rules. They redefined warfare through speed, maneuverability, devastating horse archers, and an iron discipline that made them move as a single, terrifying organism. This wasn't merely brute force. It was a surgical application of overwhelming power, delivered with precision. The Rus and Cumans, rooted in traditional heavy cavalry charges, were unprepared for this innovative, relentless onslaught. Their commanders, once eager to pursue, found themselves outflanked, outmaneuvered, and utterly overwhelmed. The sheer destructive power of the Mongol war machine, even in this relatively small advance guard, was absolute. The Khalkha wasn't just a defeat, it was an annihilation. The flower of Rus chivalry, their princes, their boyars massacred, the Cuman hordes scattered and broken. It was a decapitation strike that left an entire region vulnerable and leaderless. This battle wasn't just a loss of life. It was the eradication of an entire generation of leadership. And for what? For a fleeting moment of perceived victory, for a refusal to see the true nature of their foe. The historical significance of the Khalkha cannot be overstated. It was Europe's brutal, bloody introduction to the Mongol Empire. It was the crack in the dam, a dire foreshadowing of the devastating Mongol yoke that would descend upon Eastern Europe just a few short years later, shaping its destiny for centuries. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a blueprint for future conquests. The Rus princes were given a stark warning, etched in blood, yet they largely failed to heed it, proving once again that humanity is often doomed to repeat the lessons it refuses to learn. So what does this forgotten cataclysm offer us today? It's a timeless lesson in strategic foresight. It underscores the dangers of complacency, of allowing internal strife to erode national strength, and of fatally underestimating a truly formidable and innovative adversary. Are we truly looking at the horizon, or just at our feet? Do we recognize new threats when they emerge in unfamiliar guises, or do we dismiss them because they don't conform to our preconceived notions of conflict? The Khalkha teaches us that survival often hinges not just on strength, but on adaptability, unity, and the intellectual humility to learn from a foe, no matter how alien their methods may seem. To ignore these echoes from the past is to risk becoming yet another forgotten cautionary tale in history's long and brutal narrative.